We are very privileged to be able to partner with the Governor's Academy. And of course, Olivia is near and dear to our hearts, having been spent a crazy summer with us in the office as one of our interns. So thank you to the Governor's Academy, and thank you, Olivia, for all your hard work. And thanks to all of you for your support and your memberships over this incredibly complicated year. We are looking forward to opening our doors to the public for the first time since 2019 for our holiday open house and members party on December 4th and 5th. And we have many, many wonderful events and programs planned. So please visit our website, which is newburyhistory.org, and check out your members' weekly newsletter for details. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sharon Slater. Sharon began teaching in the history department at the Governor's Academy in 2000. For the past 10 years, she's been running the Academy archives, in addition to teaching several classes in the history department, including Advanced Placement U.S. History. Thanks for introducing Olivia, Sharon.
Thank you, Bethany. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Olivia Crisafi from Newbury, Massachusetts. Olivia is a senior at the Governor's Academy, and in addition to being an excellent historian, she's the captain of the girls cross country team. She's an avid participant in robotics competitions and a 4-year participant, and currently our senior leader of our school's delegation to the Harvard Model Congress. As you heard from Bethany, she's no stranger to the Museum of Old Newbury, having spent her summer working there and learning all the ins and outs of local history. And tonight, she's going to be presenting her research into the origins of Columbus Day. She completed this research as part of her work in my Advanced Placement U.S. History class during her junior year. One of our graduation requirements at the Governor's Academy is that students complete an independent historical research and writing project on a topic of their choice within the field of U.S. history. Olivia's research into the story behind the commemoration of Columbus Day introduced me to a tale that I'd not heard. And in this sense, she exceeded my expectations and reminded me about why it's fun to learn and teach history. I hope you find yourselves learning new things tonight as well. And now I'll turn it over to Olivia.
Thank you so much. So I'll begin sharing my screen. So just tonight, what I'll start off with is a brief introduction of my topic, followed by a brief introduction of how I got there and my interest in the topic. And then I'll kind of go through my sources and everything that led me to my ultimate thesis. So starting off, I researched Columbus Day. And so in the 21st century, as the United States approaches 250 years of age, Americans are reconsidering their past and the historical narratives they choose to propagate. Amidst the list of reconsideration lies Columbus Day. In recent years, the second Monday in October has become an opportunity to reevaluate the legacy of Christopher Columbus, rather than celebrating his discovery of the New World. In 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landing on Hispaniola, a strong movement of criticism arose, charging Columbus with initiating a genocidal, imperialistic European presence in the Americas. This criticism has grown over the last 30 years. Many Americans now choose to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day in place of Columbus Day, but a significant number of Americans still appreciate Columbus Day as an opportunity to celebrate their patriotism and heritage. Although the discussion has devolved into controversy, there is more to Columbus Day than most people realize. The resolution to such controversy might be in the history of Columbus Day itself. So my interest in this subject started off pretty young. I've always been really interested in Ellis Island, and I still remember dressing up as the Statue of Liberty when I was younger. And it was always one of my life's goals to get into the Crown. So obviously Ellis Island is way too broad of a topic to focus on for an entire thesis paper, and Ms. Slater told me as much. And so I looked to both my Italian heritage and my family's current goal to get our Italian citizenships to really start my research off with Italian immigration, which is also a broad topic. But I coupled that with an article I actually read this summer going into my junior year, and that was the article "How Italians Became White," which you can see pictured in the bottom right corner by Brent Staples. And it introduced me to a new topic and new concept that I hadn't heard before, which is that upon arrival in the United States, Italians were not considered white as they are today, as part of the white identity. And it brought up questions in my mind, one of those being, how did Italians become white? What was the catalyst of that? And additionally, what is the importance of the white identity in America? And how does that signal kind of a larger obsession with race in the United States? And so to answer these questions, I started off my research with some very simple questions. And those questions were, why did Italians emigrate to the United States in the late 19th century to begin with? What was the demographic of the immigrants that came here? So who came here? What was their experience of these first generation Italian immigrants? And then, coming back to my final question that arose from this article, how did Italians become white? And so what I found is that Italians first arrived in America in large numbers between 1880 and 1920. They were treated as the other and likened to Black Americans. The first wave of immigrants arrived from southern Italy, Mezzogiorno, where they faced discrimination from the whiter northern Italians for their darker skin, a distinction that carried over to the United States. At first, it seemed these poor artisans and peasants that arrived on American shores would solve the growing demand for laborers in the United States. Instead, however, Italians thwarted the American strike attempts and became the enemy of both American laborers and businessmen. Businessmen, who at first looked favorably upon the Italian workers who accepted lower wages, became disgusted when Italians too protested poor working conditions and insufficient wages. As a result, xenophobic Americans who already feared the surge in Italian newcomers resorted to racial prejudice to maintain superiority over Italians, referring to Italian immigrants with derogatory terms such as Dago and Guinea, and using race theory to distinguish the desirable immigrants from the undesirable immigrants. This racism became embedded in scientific practice through racial science like eugenics. Henry Goddard, a prominent American psychologist and eugenicist, decided to test the intelligence of Italian immigrants passing through Ellis Island. According to his sham trials, 79% of Italians were either morons or imbeciles upon arrival in America. His results only reinforced Americans' attitude towards immigrants, especially Southern Italians. Whiter Europeans were legitimized, while Southern Italians, with their darker coloring, were too dark to be considered legitimate Americans. As a result, Northern and Southern Italians became two distinct races. As early as 1889, the U.S. Bureau of Immigration used terminology to distinguish the Northern Italians from their Southern Italian counterparts. Northern Italians were classified as Celtic and accepted into the white identity, while Southern Italians were classified as Iberic and likened to Black Americans. Such discrimination was rooted in the failures of the American binary racial structure, which was unable to classify their identity. Eventually, this discrimination surpassed semantics and became systematic discrimination. As nativist pressure mounted to preserve the purity of the American population, the federal government passed legislation limiting undesirable new immigrants from entering America. The 1882 Immigration Act charged immigrants a head tax of 50 cents to enter America. In the 1880s and 1890s, Italians were the largest group of immigrants by ethnicity. In 1880, 300,000 Italian immigrants lived in America. Just a decade later, in 1890, there were twice as many. While most of these Italians immigrating to the United States were funneled through Ellis Island, the primary port of immigration in the United States, federal immigration stations in cities such as Boston, Baltimore, New York, and New Orleans also received immigrants. In cities with large number of Italian immigrant populations, violence often broke out between Italian immigrants and native-born Americans. Although New Orleans was coping with racial and power struggles leading to an unstable environment in the late 19th century, at first New Orleans welcomed Southern Italian immigrants, proving to be an anomaly of immigrant cities. Southern Italians came in large numbers to New Orleans in the 19th century and took up jobs in fields as laborers. New Orleans, which traded large quantities of citrus with Palermo, the capital city of Sicily, encouraged this immigration to staff their industries. Overall, 90% of immigrants to New Orleans were Sicilian. Despite the American opinion of Italians in the mid-19th century, the press in New Orleans was especially in favor of Italian immigrants, even southern Italian Sicilians. The New Orleans press was even one of the strongest advocates for the open door policy when Italians were criticized for being a dangerous population. In 1889, the New Orleans press stated that, quote, the Italian colony embraces some of the most worthy, respectable, and highly esteemed citizens of New Orleans, and that it would be, quote, a gross injustice to cast reflections on their good name for the crimes of a few of their race, end quote. Despite its marred history of racial struggles and the tensions in other port cities where Italian immigrants arrived, New Orleans seemed a promising safe haven for Southern Italians. The turning point in New Orleans' public opinion of Italians, however, came as a result of Northern rhetoric and the correlation between Southern Italians and mafia. Influence from the North, which designated Italians as dirty and dangerous, as well as movement of Italians from rural areas to urban enclaves, caused the perception of Italians in New Orleans to turn negative. Americans, especially Northern Americans, despised Italians' lack of assimilation and their cultural enclaves scattered around America's coastal cities. These communities, where Italians lived together in close proximity, were referred to as Little Italies for their high concentration of Italians. New Orleans had its own Little Italy, filled with Italians who took up work operating fruit stands, groceries, and other local businesses, cooking traditional dishes and speaking Italian freely. Despite their hard work, Americans feared Italians who lived in these tenements, referred to as ghettos, would plague their city. The Los Angeles Times highlighted the difference between German and Italian immigrants, both lumped into the new immigrant designation, declaring that Germans come to America to become Americans. Rumors spread in the broader United States that the Italian government was sending Italians to America to get rid of them. Northern American dispatches went as far as warning Americans that Italians posed a, quote, a severe tax upon the assimilative powers of the nation, end quote, and that they were a curse to themselves and a burden upon charity. Perhaps the reference that best captures Americans' feelings towards Italians was visible through comparison to invading parasites like locusts. It seemed to Americans that Italians came to America with the express purpose of infiltrating their superior race. As New Orleans' perspective on Italians began to change, discourse in Louisiana became focused on the correlation between Sicilians and the mafia. Reports described the Southern Italian practice of vendetta and blood vengeance, and regularly interpreted all instances of crime in or against the Italian community as a result of mafia. In New Orleans, race had already emerged as a social construct to distinguish between the subjugated Black population and the supposedly superior white Americans who lived amongst them. This racism, along with anti-immigrant nativism and lynchings, were social tools New Orleanians leveraged against foreign Italian immigrants arriving on their shores. Lynchings of contadini, Southern Italian peasants, became commonplace in the New Orleans area. Between 1886 and 1910, 12 Sicilians and other Italians were lynched. The roots of Columbus Day lie more in 1892 than they do in 1492. On the evening of October 15, 1890, David C. Hennessy, pictured in the top left, strolled up Rampart Street, one of the many unpaved streets in the old French Quarter of New Orleans, after a long day at work. Hennessy had just finished a small meal of half a dozen oysters, accompanied by his friend and colleague, Bill O'Connor, at one of his favorite places, Dominique Verget's Oyster Saloon at Rampart and Poydras Streets. The two continued on to Girard Street, and after finishing their conversation, O'Connor reported that Hennessy said, quote, "There's no need to come any further with me now, Bill. You go on your own way," end quote. They exchanged a handshake, and O'Connor crossed the muddy street, heading towards the Mississippi River. Hennessy continued in the opposite direction, heading home to 275 Girard Street, where he lived with his mother in a neighborhood of dilapidated cottages, boarding houses, and shanties, primarily inhabited by Blacks and Italian immigrants. At 32 years old, Hennessy was not only one of the youngest police chiefs in the nation, but also one of the most well-known. Since his years as a young detective, newspapers across the nation had headlined his famous cases. Hennessy had earned his reputation as an exemplary young man, especially for capturing the notorious Italian bandit Giuseppe Esposito in 1881 as a teenager, and he was widely regarded as the foremost expert on Sicilian stiletto and vendetta societies. For this work combating organized crime, his reputation and fame as a fearless, aggressive detective grew, and Hennessy thoroughly enjoyed the status. One block before Girard Street, Hennessy's legendary toughness was tested. Interrupting his peaceful, eventless night, 5 men appeared across the street and opened fire on Hennessy before he even had the chance to turn around. The shots speckled the sidewalk, and the building behind him where a mother and her 2 children huddled frightened inside. As Hennessy's attackers fled west toward Basin Street, he drew his pistol and pursued the gunman, firing 2 shots through the smoke. He finally collapsed, calling "Billy, Billy," as he fell. Witnesses later said they heard from as little as 6 to as many as 20 shots fired. At the sound of the gunshots, O'Connor ran back the way he came towards the scene where 2 policemen already stood. As he later reported, bending over the chief, I said to him, "Who gave it to you, Dave?" Hennessy's infamous whispered reply wreaked havoc on the surrounding community of Italian immigrants, his neighbors, living in the slums of New Orleans, Dagos. No soul other than O'Connor heard such a declaration. As Hennessy fought a losing battle that night in the hospital, O'Connor addressed the reporters, city officials, and police in attendance in the corridor outside Hennessy's room, repeating the Dagos narrative. Mayor Shakespeare followed suit, giving orders to the police in the crowd to scour the whole neighborhood, arrest every Italian you come across. By the time Hennessy died at 9:06 a.m. the next morning, 50 Italians had been arrested. In the following 24 hours, between 1 and 200 more would be rounded up. The morning issue of the New Orleans Times-Democrat ominously called upon New Orleanians to form committees and assist officers in driving the mafia, a phrase coined during the mass immigration of Sicilians, out of New Orleans. The Times-Democrat even went as far as to urge the city council to endorse vigilante groups. Following Shakespeare's orders, policemen both city and private scoured the area for evidence. The acting police chief reported that no Sicilians would be able to leave the city unobserved, and that any who couldn't give a straight account of themselves for the past 24 hours would be promptly arrested. Italians were targeted for the crime on minimal evidence and arrested en masse. The New York Times reported that the police hustled them into jail with considerable rude treatment. At a time of ineffective policing and before the FBI, private police forces patrolled and rivaled the city's police force in both power and authority. Such was the case in New Orleans with the Boylian police force and the city's police department. The work of the city's police department, previously headed by Hennessy, and of the rival Boolean protective police force, headed by O'Connor, his friend, was ineffective, mostly due to the lack of any concrete evidence. The validity of the entire search party rested on O'Connor's claim, which hadn't been corroborated by any other witnesses. A questionable cause for rounding up Italians gave way to more suspicious police activity. One witness, who had previously claimed that he hadn't seen any of the faces of the gunmen, was nevertheless used as a witness to identify 3 Italian men held in the Central Police Station. Even more peculiar, the papers reported that Officer Cotton of Boolean's police force had been grazed on the head by one of Hennessy's shots, and that Boolean's officer J.C. Rowe had been shot in the ear by another. Unless the men were directly involved in the shooting, these wounds are difficult to explain. Such wounds were reported in the next day's papers and disappeared from the records of the evening afterwards. Further suspicion arose at Hennessy's murder trial when only 2 of the 10 police officers who claimed to have seen Hennessy's assailants were called to testify. Bill O'Connor, the key witness in the claims that Dagos killed the chief, was one of the 8 not called to the stand. In the months that followed, Hennessy became glorified as a hero as tensions between Italians and native New Orleanians mounted. Hennessy's funeral was one of the grandest processions the city had ever seen, eclipsing even that of Jefferson Davis 2 years previous. Such pomp and circumstance served to erase any shadowy circumstances regarding both the lack of evidence against the Italians and Hennessy's questionable past. Young Hennessy had grown up surrounded by violence, and he had a violent record himself. As a boy, Hennessy's father had been shot and killed by an enemy, and Hennessy was not only known for single-handedly beating up 2 grown men, but also for murdering another. As the Louisiana historian John S. Kendall put it, quote, "He would have been what we nowadays call a gangster if he had not happened to line up on the side of law and order," end quote. Despite Hennessy's record and the lack of evidence, the crusade against immigrant Italians continued. At the forefront of this crusade was Mayor Shakespeare, who spearheaded the formation of a committee to thoroughly investigate the matter of the existence of secret societies. Just a side note, at this point in New Orleans, the extent of organized crime groups were petty thieves. This committee, known as the Committee of 50, published threatening letters addressed to the Italian population. One read, "We must teach these people a lesson they will not forget for all of time." Mayor Shakespeare declared this at one such committee meeting, foreshadowing the bloodbath to come. On March 14th, in 1891, tensions in New Orleans came to a head. After weeks of media frenzy and propaganda surrounding the trial of the 11 Italians suspected for the murder of Hennessy, the judge read the verdict. For 3, the trial was rendered a mistrial, and the other 6 men were acquitted. Another side note, the 19 suspects were to be tried in 2 separate trials in order to prevent mafia interference. The crowd outside the courthouse yelled and shouted as rumors of mafia bribery spread. The next morning, March 14th, New Orleans newspapers called for a mass meeting to remedy the failure of justice in the Hennessy case. That morning, a vigilante mob of between 8,000 and 10,000 New Orleanians crowded into Congo Square and stormed the county jailhouse to ensure justice was indeed served. They lynched 11 of the Italian suspects in what came to be known as the largest mass lynching in American history. The victims were beaten with clubs, and 2 were strung up in the street for the public to view. Members of the mob shot wildly at the already dead victims, using the brutalized bodies for target practice. The bullet-ridden corpses sent a clear message. If the jury would not deliver justice, the vigilante mob would. Pasquale Corte, the Italian consul in New Orleans, unfair rounding up of Italian Americans since the death of Hennessy. When he drove by the jailhouse square in his carriage and saw the square littered with the blood of the victims, Corte fled to Italy, entrusting a friend with his personal statement in case it came to be needed. After New Orleans' mayor, Joseph A. Shakespeare, suggested that Corte be barred from re-entry, Corte's letter was published in the Sunday New York Times issue, claiming that the lynching had been prearranged and that Shakespeare was responsible. The Italian consul to the United States withdrew and followed Pasquale Corte back to Italy, resulting in diplomatic tensions between the 2 countries and whispers of possible war with Italy. In 1892, to ease these tensions and placate Italian diplomats, President Benjamin Harrison, pictured on the left, declared the national celebration of Columbus Day on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in America. Harrison even issued a statement describing Columbus as the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. This 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival marked the atonement for sins, America's sins against Italian Americans. So just to get into my primary sources a little bit, these are the main primary sources that I used to do my research on both the incident in New Orleans, as well as the public opinion regarding that followed the incident, as well as learning about Italians immigrating to the United States. And so on the left, I have on the left and bottom, I have 2 New York Times Machine articles. And those were really helpful for getting dates and reading the actual articles as they were published on that day. And I could go back all the way to the 1890s. So that was super helpful, as well as letters Up here on the top is a letter from Police Chief Hennessy, and another letter on the right here that I'll talk about later a little bit in the public opinion section. And then all the way at the top, I accessed Christopher Columbus's journal. And then my secondary sources were the most helpful in contributing to my research on the lynching itself. So the foremost work on the lynching is Richard Gambino's Vendetta, which is pictured here on the left. That was a super useful source. And the second one that I really looked to inform me about the lynching and the aftermath. And then the middle source by Jessica Barbata Jackson, called Before the Lynching, really gave me some background knowledge about the experience of Italians in New Orleans and the climate in terms of racial power struggles and race in general. And that's similar to the article or the Jessica Barbata Jackson's piece, Dixie's Italians, that gave me some more background information on the Italian American experience in the South. And then again, pictured here is the article that started me off on this whole research in the beginning, How Italians Became White. And so this brings me to my thesis, which is that the roots of Columbus Day lie more in 1891 than they do in 1492. Columbus Day in 1892 was celebrated for the atonement of America's sins, and although history is paved over the story of the 1891 lynching, understanding the event plays a vital role in the current controversy. While Christopher Columbus's epochal journey represents the beginning of a period of imperialist exploitation, the celebration of Columbus Day has a separate legacy altogether. So now I'll go over some of the evolution of Columbus Day as a national holiday, beginning with the Tammany Hall Society and their celebration of Columbus in the 18th century. For many years, Columbus had not been such a celebrated figure. For 300 years after Columbus first set sail in 1492, his legacy went widely unrecognized. By the 18th century, however, as Americans became increasingly independent from Great Britain, the colonists looked to redefine themselves and find new symbols to represent their distinct identity. As Americans fought the Revolutionary War, they celebrated Columbus as a national hero. Americans seeking independence clung to the symbolism of venturing out into an unknown ocean. Thus, Columbus became the namesake of Columbia University, formerly King's College, the nation's capital, and even some, such as Samuel Sewall of Byfield, suggested the whole country be designated Columbia. It is evident that these new Americans found refuge in the symbolism of Columbus. Like the Italian immigrants, they reworked Columbus's story into one that fit their purposes and could guide them into uncertainty. Their 18th century Columbian celebrations reached a climax in 1792 when the Society of Tammany, also known as the Columbian Order, celebrated the 300th anniversary of Columbus's landing. Founded in New York City in 1782, the order was a fraternal, patriotic society that honored both Christopher Columbus as an idealized patriotic explorer and Tammand, an idealized indigenous chief of the Delaware tribe, known for his benevolence. To colonists, these two figures served as symbols of American independence from European society, especially Britain. Ironically, members of the society took on Native American names, all while celebrating the man who introduced the native populations to their demise. The Columbian Order was also known for its responsibility developing the 19th century Democratic Party in New York. The society leveraged their local political power as the executive committee of the party to head the city's celebration of the 300th anniversary of Columbus Day. While the 1792 celebration had a marginal impact on the greater public opinion of Christopher Columbus, it acted as a precursor to the more widespread celebrations that followed. Public opinion regarding Columbus's eventful journey in 1492 has evolved since Columbus's first celebration in 1792. In the 21st century, Columbus represents the beginning of a period of European extinction of Indigenous peoples. When Columbus set out on his transatlantic voyage, he sought a direct water route from Europe to Asia to improve trade possibilities. Upon arrival in the Americas, Columbus found neither the water route nor the precious commodities he had set out in search of. Instead, Columbus found interest in the native peoples, as noted in his detailed travel journal. In an effort to profit off the native population, Columbus established settlement in the Caribbean. In lieu of the luxuries he set out for, Columbus returned to Queen Isabella with 500 native slaves, much to her horror. By 1498, following Columbus's third voyage, the native Taino population in the islands were devastated by Columbus's demands. Forced to mine gold and work on plantations, their population had fallen from its originally estimated 250,000 to just a few hundred. This brutal legacy Columbus left in his wake was not recognized until the late 20th century. During the 20th century, a variety of lobbyists and presidents were responsible for instating Columbus Day as a permanent nationally celebrated holiday, following the one-time national celebration in 1892. After lobbying from the Knights of Columbus to designate October 11th Columbus Day, Congress under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted the national holiday in 1934. On Columbus Day in 1942, Roosevelt's Attorney General Francis Biddle announced the removal of the enemy aliens designation for Italians, along with the plan to offer citizenship to 200,000 elderly Italians living in the United States, who had been unable to acquire citizenship due to the literacy requirement. In the late 1960s, the National Columbus Day Committee pushed for recognition of Columbus Day as the second Monday in October, a goal realized in 1971 after being signed into legislation by President Johnson in 1968. 20 years later, in 1988, when Ronald Reagan signed the Columbus Day Proclamation, he glorified Columbus in the upcoming 1992 celebration as the inventor of the American dream. Such high praise and symbolism has now undergone over 2 decades of reconsideration. As 20th century Americans moved to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, the event became the focus of bitter controversy. The celebration of the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival marked the beginnings of widespread reconsideration of Columbus's legacy. Movement towards the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day, the alternative to Columbus Day, started with the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Peoples in 1990. Indigenous peoples from around the world met in Geneva, Switzerland, to plan for a celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day in 1992. In June 1991, the Protecting Mother Earth Conference in Black Hills, South Dakota, called for the 1990s to be the decade of Indigenous peoples. This celebration, in place of Columbus Day, was adopted in Berkeley, California on October 22, 1991. The following year, the first Indigenous Peoples Day was celebrated nationally following a call for the national boycott of Columbus Day in 1992. In the past 30 years, support for the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day has grown. No longer do Americans blindly accept the narrative of virtuous Christopher Columbus, but rather they challenge that narrative, looking for more equitable alternatives for Columbus Day. Today, the current controversy revolves around the problematic legacy of Christopher Columbus and the signals Columbus Day celebrations send, especially to marginalized Americans. The resolution to this controversy lies in 1892 in New Orleans with the lynching of the 11 Italian men and the subsequent celebration of Columbus Day. Columbus Day in 1892 was celebrated for the atonement of America's sins. And although history is paved over the story of the 1891 lynching, understanding the event plays a vital role in the current controversy. While Christopher Columbus's epochal journey represents the beginning of a period of imperialist exploitation, the celebration of Columbus Day has a separate legacy altogether. Italian Americans who celebrate Columbus Day don't celebrate Columbus's brutalization of the New World, but rather their heritage and struggles in the United States. Celebrating Columbus Day has been a significant catalyst of acceptance for Italian Americans in the United States. By attaching themselves to a part of American history, they become interwoven into the white identity and thus protected from racial violence. After years of scrutiny and discrimination at the hands of American law enforcement, public, and press, Italian Americans have earned the right to celebrate their histories. It is impossible, however, to separate the connotation Christopher Columbus carries from the celebration of Columbus Day. Christopher Columbus himself stands for nothing positive. His lone accomplishment, discovering the New World, occurred purely by accident and resulted in, quote, the greatest population catastrophe in human history, according to historian Eric Foner. Columbus, therefore, must be recognized as the villain he was. He not only represents the beginning of a period of imperialist exploitation, but the cultural discrimination and insensitivity experienced by both original peoples indigenous to America and by the Southern Italian immigrants who so fervently celebrated him. Therefore, it is crucial to recognize the history Columbus carries, learn from it, and improve upon it. Rather than doing away with Columbus Day entirely, the nation should move to commemorate the marginalization of both immigrants and Native peoples in a united celebration of marginalized peoples. This Marginalized Peoples Day will serve to remind Americans that bigotry has been embedded in America's history since Columbus first arrived on American shores. Just as Columbus viewed natives as a different race, Italian Americans had to find a place in America's complex racial structure. As America moves forward, recognizing this obsession with the social construct of race and attempting to erase boundaries between ethnic groups will ultimately serve to strengthen the nation. Columbus Day has represented America's sin since its inception, but it is our job to reclaim the holiday. Thank you, and any questions?
Thank you very much, Olivia. That was really wonderful, and I think that we all enjoyed your presentation. And I am going to ask folks, if you do have any questions, if you go down to the bottom of your screen and you will see the chat feature, feel free to post your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that Olivia gets a chance to answer them. And let's see, Olivia, we have one question from Claire Mitchell asking, after the lynching of the 11 Italians in 1891, do you think this event was influential relating to legislation moving forward?
Yeah, so one of the biggest components in what sparked the legislation by Benjamin Harrison and the diplomatic tension was the public opinion that formed following the lynching. And so many prominent American politicians and just American figures chimed in with their 2 cents on the lynching and the aftermath. And so, you know, for example, Henry Cabot Lodge insisted that such acts as the killing of these 11 Italians do not spring from nothing without reason or provocation. In court, the jury cited the mob as several thousand of the first, best, and even most law-abiding citizens. There was even a ballad that was created about the lynching. And, you know, like it just became, it was celebrating the lynching. It was, now we have shown our Southern blood, for nowhere will you find a town that would have justice and fair play of this kind. We would not have the verdict given by them, men of nerve. It seems to us as if the case has quite a crooked curve. The execution was gone through quickly and done by gentlemen, and everyone will agree it could never be a sin. And so people would go around singing that. So the public opinion turned very negative. And resulted to this really serious tension between the Italian immigrants that led Pasquale Corte to have to flee and the Italian diplomat to follow him, that really sparked Benjamin Harrison to have the first national celebration.
Thank you. Another person would like to know a little bit more about these classifications between the Northern and Southern Italians, with the Northerns being the Celtic Italians as opposed to the Southern Iberian Italians. And where did you learn about that?
Okay, this was kind of the beginning of my research over a year ago. So I'll admit I don't exactly remember the exact source, although I could get it if you're really interested. However, I got a lot of that information from Italian databases. And Yeah, I mean, in Italy, there is already kind of an existing racial structure with the northern and southern Italians, and so that kind of same structure just carried over into the United States by virtue of immigration, this hierarchy, so to speak. But I'm not completely sure about that information, although I can get it if you want.
Okay. Somebody else was asking about the photograph and the text record on the first slide. Did you say that that was something related to your own ancestors? And when did your ancestors emigrate from Italy to the US?
Yeah, so the document on the first slide here, I'll bring it up. So that document right there is a document of my family's, one of my family members' immigration to the United States through Ellis Island. And it's a document that my mom actually found while she was applying for the Italian citizenships, which is quite cool. I think she got it on Ancestry, so very fun.
I was just about to ask if that was through ancestry.com.
Yeah, it's
so you're not shelling for them right now, but still.
Yeah.
We have another question about whether or not you think it would be possible at this point to have something like an Italian Heritage Day rather than a Columbus Day, which obviously makes sense that Italian Americans would embrace Columbus Day, but an Italian Heritage Day might be a little less of a lightning rod. And they also mention Columbus Day as becoming Indigenous Peoples Day and this being a separate entity. What would you think about something like that? Do you think it could work?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, especially because Columbus Day in its celebration today has become a celebration of Italian heritage, and Columbus is more of a figurehead for that. And so I think it could be problematic to try and separate his legacy because, or try and erase his legacy from that. However, I think it could easily be done because it's what the celebration has become in present day. Like if you go to the North End on Columbus Day, it's going to be Italian flags everywhere, rather than focused on Columbus himself. And I think turning Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day, I think that could definitely work, and separating the two. But I think I think that is currently a divisive issue, and it's gonna take a bit before that happens fully. But it's definitely important to recognize the history behind it.
There's another question about Columbus Day, and someone was asking whether or not your research ever led you down the path of looking at Columbus Day after 1947 as tied into the US Cold War agenda of embracing the Italians as opposed to what was going on with the Soviets. I don't know.
This is something, yeah, it's something I brushed up upon in my research, but I was already kind of broad, so I didn't want to talk too much about it. Just from the surface level, what I found about it is that in that way, Columbus Day served as a national identification for Americans in much of the same way as it had for Italian Americans in assimilating into into America. And I think it speaks to coming together under a figure. And I think it's quite interesting, especially when you relate it to how Italian Americans used it to really come together and become a part of America. But I didn't research it really in depth, so I don't have a ton to say on that. I'm definitely interested in looking into it more, though, for sure.
See, this is the joy of history, is you keep
right. There's always more
research. Someone else asked a little bit about your research pre-Columbus's arrival and whether or not you had a chance to investigate any bigotry that could have taken place with earlier, like Nordic explorers or things like that.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, and it was definitely present. I focused my research on Columbus Day and kind of at Columbus's arrival and following, so I didn't really get into that. But I'm definitely not arguing that Columbus was the only one who was genocidal, but just that his start of the triggering the Columbian Exchange really brought that in excess, and it changed the entire dynamic of the Americas.
I think we are starting to hit the end of our questions, and I'm hoping that I got all of them. Somebody's telling me I missed one. When you were researching New Orleans society, did you find any information on the old French family and Catholic Church?
I did not. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of families in New Orleans, so I didn't come up on that specific one, but yeah, no.
Oh, well.
Maybe, yeah, I'll look into it though.
Look into it. Churches are always the root of so much cultural history.
It's true.
It is. When you're doing historical research, check out the churches.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anyone else who would like their last opportunity to ask something of Olivia? Oh, the author of that book, Vendetta, do you know if he was from New Orleans?
I do not know if he's from New Orleans. I have the book right here though, so I could look. Let's see.
There's a little author's bio.
Let's pull it up. Well, he holds a PhD in philosophy from New York University, but it doesn't say if he's from New Orleans, although I'm sure a quick Google search could get you that.
Alas. And then last question, I think, before we hand it back to Bethany, is even though we know you have gone past your last Columbus Day at the Governor's Academy, would you like to see them celebrate or not celebrate Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day / marginalized people?
I think this is a very interesting question for me, because especially in the past couple of years, and last year, especially while I was researching Columbus Day, it was really interesting to see the portrayal of Columbus Day. And I think for the most part, Govs is a very progressive place. And so we very much moved away from celebrating Columbus and on to celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. But I think what I'd like to see for the celebration of Columbus Day for the future at Govs is a recognition of the history of Columbus Day and its importance to Italian Americans, while also recognizing that Columbus himself is a terrible man. And it's our job to kind of, again, as I said, reclaim that holiday. So I think moving away from it while still recognizing its history.
Very diplomatically put. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, Olivia.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Bethany.
Thank you so much, Sharon and Olivia. You just, it's so wonderful to hear someone who not only does the research, but brings their own passion and their own interests into the research they do. So I will just say it was a pleasure working with you all summer. I thank you for bringing some of that enthusiasm to the Museum of Old Newbury. And I will take a minute to thank the Florence Evans Bushy Foundation that provides us with interns every summer. So we'll thank them for our time with you. So thank you again, Olivia. Good luck in everything you do. Thank you to all of you who have been watching and listening here. We so appreciate your support, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully in person very soon. Olivia, I'm going to be looking for you at the holiday party on the
I'll be there.
5th of December. All right, can't wait. So we'll see you all very soon, and thank you again. Good night,
Thanks
everyone.
everyone for coming.